Chapter 1 of my book, Gonzo Education for Mom. Available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. The Ford. The whole point of the little fella is that no matter how down on his ass he is, no matter how well the jackals succeed in tearing him apart, he's still a man of dignity. He can still look down on you and your whole bloody bunch of money-hungry scum. Charlie Chaplin. Chapter 1. Let's be homeless. In third grade, the worst thing you could grow up to be was a garbage man. Lots of kids wanted to be doctors and lawyers, but if one third grader wanted to insult another third grader, he'd say they're going to grow up to be a garbage man. As an adult, I see my peers were wrong with this assessment. Garbage men get paid good money and receive excellent benefits. In most cities, they have support of a union, which guarantees them job security and a living wage. My life would have been easier, but less interesting if I would have been a garbage man. The first time I was homeless was when I was 16 in 1996. My fraternal twin brother, Michael, and I were having problems with our father, but we've been dealing with his shit since we were 4 and had pretty much gotten used to it by this time. Our mother wanted custody, but her schizophrenia caused a nervous breakdown shortly after we were born. We were her second set of twins. Our 2 sisters were born 4 years earlier. The odds of a woman having 2 sets of twins is 1 in 700,000. I don't know what the odds of a woman having 2 sets of twins and schizophrenia is, but I'm guessing it's pretty low. Our father made it clear he wanted nothing to do with Michael and me the second we met him at age 4. We never called him dad or ever had a conversation with him. We didn't know what college he went to, what part of New York he was from, or how many brothers and sisters he had. We lived in his house for 10 years, but he was a stranger. Most of our childhood, he made us sleep in a tiny closet in the garage. He should have been thrown in jail for some of the things he did. All we knew that he was a university professor who didn't like us. He was nice to our sisters. They were named after girlfriends he had before Mom. He lied about his age to them, said he was younger than he actually was, and told them that he never lost a tooth, even though he wore a full set of dentures. He didn't seem to mind our sisters, but he reminded Michael and me how much he despised us daily. Around the time we turned 12, he told us that he was going to kick us out on our 17th birthday. That day was coming, but like millions of other kids around the world, we'd spent our whole lives surviving on this planet with very little help from him. Having one less asshole giving us shit on a daily basis was in our best interest. One day, Michael got in a huge fight with him over a driver's ed course he took without his signature. We said about 20 words to our father the entire time we lived there, so not having him sign a piece of paper shouldn't have been a big deal. The reason he was pissed was because Michael had paid for the class on his own with his own money. That weekend, we were supposed to go on a road trip with our door-to-door newspaper sales crew. We'd been working the job for over 2 years, longer than anyone else. Our crew boss, John, this ass alcoholic, had planned a weekend sales trip to Corpus Christi, but when our father found out Michael took a driver's ed course without permission, he said we couldn't go. The physical part of their battle happened in the front entryway. I had a good vantage point from the top of the stairs. Our father never went upstairs, so it always felt safe. I watched the whole ordeal, but didn't get involved. I remember the fight starting vertically, with both of them yelling in each other's faces like baseball players. When Michael tried to walk away, our father forcefully grabbed his arm, and Michael pushed him away. Our father was shocked. Neither of us had ever stood up to him like that before, so he grabbed my brother by the throat and threw him on the entryway floor. Then he got on top of him and put all of his weight on Michael's chest and whispered nasty things a parent should never say to their child. I remember the foam building up around our father's mouth and watching it as it slowly dripped down and onto the side of Michael's cheek. The only thing Michael could do was close his eyes to try to avoid emotional scars. The incident had a profound effect on me and my brother's psyche, and we were never quite the same. It was the final moments of our brief childhood, and neither of us would ever try to make an emotional connection with our father or any other authority figure again. At the time, I didn't quite understand the implications. I just wanted to go on a road trip with my friends. Our newspaper boss, John, was going to be in front of the house honking his horn any minute. There would be a van chock full of delinquent teenagers in front of our house. Michael was fighting for both of us. I didn't have the guts at the time, but my brother did. Our father's treatment toward us was one of the strongest bonds we shared. He always spoke to us as if we were one person. He didn't talk to us much, but when he did, he'd call us you boys and never actually called us by our names. Mom was in and out of the Kerrville State Mental Hospital when we were growing up, and we hardly ever saw her. She lived across town, worked 2 jobs, and was on a ton of medication. She said we were the most important thing to her, but the only affection we got from her or from anyone else in that matter came in the form of a weekday afternoon or every other weekend if she wasn't committed to the state hospital. The majority of our childhood we spent alone in a cold garage with no toys, parents, or guidance. We learned about the world, how people spoke, and society's manners from neighborhood kids and cable TV. Their fight probably only lasted a few minutes, but it felt like forever. They wrestled around the entryway floor until Michael finally slipped away and ran for safety in the front yard. Our father wasn't going to continue being violent if the neighbors could see. Most of the families in the vicinity of our house had been reporting him to social services for a wide variety of reasons for years. Our sisters would prep us on what to say in order to not get him in trouble. It was the only time any of them were nice to us. Don't tell him about the puppy that got hanged or how you boys live in the garage, they'd say. Seconds after Michael ran outside, our newspaper boss, John, pulled up to the house. Michael wiped his tears and jumped in the van like nothing happened. I went outside but hesitated to get in. I walked to the driver's side window to talk to our boss. John asked what was going on, and I told him our father said we couldn't go on the trip. John swung his head around and glared at Michael, already comfortable in the back. John knew our father was an asshole. On more than one occasion, he tried to start a conversation with him when he was picking us up or dropping us off. John just wanted to tell him I was the crew's top salesman and breaking all the San Antonio sales records. Our father was rude and refused to speak to him or even look in his direction. John always took the high road and never responded back or got salty. I stood by the van, not really knowing what to do. The rest of the crew had already been picked up. Jonathan, Benny, and all the other guys were shouting, "Get in, Greg, get in, G, come on." I could have let them down. I was the sales leader and the most important part of the crew. At that moment, I decided to make an adult decision and not let my friends down. I looked back at the house and saw our father glaring out the window. He was seeing if I got in the van. He wanted me to get in the van. It'd give him a reason to change the locks, bolt the windows, and make sure neither of us ever stepped foot in his house again. John and I agreed to meet at Dairy Queen later. He'd take the crew to sell a few in-town subscriptions and then come and pick me up. I watched them drive away and felt a pang in my stomach. My life was about to change. For the first time, I felt the stress of being an adult. I didn't go back inside the house. Instead, I walked to the Dairy Queen Mom used to take us to. The only other time we got ice cream was when our father would buy a half-gallon of pecan praline. And I fucking hate pecan praline. My plan was to call the house when we got to the motel in Corpus Christi. Our father would have already gone to sleep, and I could leave a message on the answering machine saying I was staying at a friend's house. When I got to Dairy Queen, I ordered a Butterfinger Blizzard and ate it slowly. I wasn't hungry. I kept thinking about what happened. I couldn't get the image of our father beating Michael out of my head. My memory is like 1950s fly pepper, catching things I'd rather not want to continue to see. I threw away the Blizzard, left Dairy Queen, and went to the barber shop Mom used to take us to. I looked inside and thought about what it would be like if Mom had custody. Our father never once paid for a haircut, took us to the doctor, the dentist, or even bought us any toiletries. Without our mom's help, things would have been worse. I left the barber shop and still had time to kill, so I walked down the street to the elementary school we used to go to. We had fond memories there, and when we got older, we'd still meet our friends on the basketball court there a few afternoons a week to shoot hoops. I took my time strolling around my little kid stomping ground and reminisced. I felt 100 years old, but I was 16. It was Friday afternoon and there was no one around. I was isolated and alone. I walked by the swings, the monkey bars, and the soccer field, conjuring up what felt like distant memories from recess and lunchtime. After it got dark, I went back to Dairy Queen and spotted John pulling up with a van full of screaming teenagers. Michael was sitting by himself in the corner. He didn't drink much back then and was solemn and quiet, with a few noticeable scratches and a blue bruise under his left eye. All the other kids were acting exactly how you expect a bunch of smashed kids who were about to go on an unsupervised road trip. It was like Lord of the Flies, and the only adult there had already tossed back 20 beers. I got in and John asked me to drive. How about we let Michael drive instead? Whatever. I'm drunk, John replied. Michael got behind the wheel and John passed out in the front passenger seat, and a few other of the guys fished currency out of his muddled jeans pockets while Michael drove us to the Texas coast. The trip wasn't as fun as it normally would have been because of what happened before we left. I never called our father from the motel, and I was nervous the whole weekend. I didn't sell as much as I usually do, and I couldn't relax. I had no idea what our father was going to do when we got back. I didn't actually do anything wrong, but Michael had finally stood up to him, and whatever response he had was going to be big and for us both. I started to feel sick on the Sunday night drive back, and John had to pull over so I could throw up. Michael, on the other hand, didn't seem very concerned and said I was worrying over nothing. What are we going to do if we get kicked out? I asked. We'll just live in the woods or Jonathan's backyard, he said. Jonathan was another kid in the newspaper crew who started about the same time we did. He was pretty much a loser before he met us, a clone of his wannabe gangster sister. Michael and I introduced him to weed, Nirvana, and Marlboro Reds. If it doesn't work out at Jonathan's, then we can just stay with John, Michael said. Yes, that'd be fun, I sarcastically told him. We'll live with John and his wife and their 3 kids. John dropped all the other kids in the crew off before heading to our house. He drove up the hill on our street slower than usual. Our father was an early riser and a deep sleeper, so if we got back late enough, there'd be a chance he'd already gone to bed and we could sneak inside and go to school the next morning like nothing happened. Just before we were about to get out of the van, John told us if our father started getting violent, then we should come back outside and go with him to his house. I'll just have to talk to the wife, he said. John said he'd be waiting outside and to let him know how it goes. So we can just stay with you? My brother Michael asked John. Well, I'm not even going to try to get in then. I was a kid, not really sure what was going on, but I knew I had an algebra quiz the next morning and wanted a little sleep. John and Michael said that they'd wait in the van to see if I got in okay. I didn't know what to expect, but I didn't want to get in any more trouble than I was. The house looked hollow, like nobody lived there. I tried to open the front door, but it was locked. Our father never gave us keys, so that wasn't unusual. I jumped the fence and tried the back door, locked too. The final option was always a second floor bedroom window. So I shimmied up the side of the house, jumped on the roof, and tiptoed over there. I tried to push the window up, but it wouldn't budge. I looked closer and saw a long wooden board locking it in place. Our father had took every precaution to make sure we couldn't get back inside. I went back to the van and told John I couldn't get in. Neither him or Michael was as surprised as I was, but I see nothing of me and my father. During the drive to John's, we told him we didn't want to go to high school anymore. John thought this was a good idea and saw high school as something that got in the way with us selling newspaper subscriptions. Dude, if all you want to do is score with the perky broads, wait until you get to college, dude, because all the girls put out, John said. John was the first adult who told me that I could still get into college without finishing high school. Dude, a GED is just as good as a high school diploma, he said. What the hell? Dude, goofy. Goofy stuff. All right, sorry about that. Dude, if all you want to do is score at the perky broads, a GED is just as good as a high school diploma, he said. You could get a master's degree, a PhD, whatever. Can I still go to the University of Texas? I asked. I want to go to UT in Austin and major in journalism, I told him. Sure can, dude. And you're getting a head start with the paper business, he said in his high pitched sales voice. Dude, if you go to community college route, you get all your basics together, make a few good grades, meet a few broads, and wham, you're on your way to the University of Texas. You could do it. John gave honest advice. He was the only adult that we know that did. Greg, you're a smart kid. That's obvious, he said. It's not about having smarts, though. It's about taking what you have and applying it. Do something with your brain, dude. I could tell John actually believed in me, one of the few adults who did. Staying at John's house was awkward, and it was obvious his wife wasn't happy. They already had 3 kids and didn't want to add 2 delinquent teenagers. However, their kids enjoyed our company. His 2 young boys liked to practice their wrestling moves on Michael, and their little girl pretended I was a singer in her favorite boy band. Our first night there, I got in trouble when John caught me flushing pot seeds down their new low flow toilet. I'd never seen him so pissed and got uncomfortable while he scolded me in their family bathroom like I was one of his own kids. I couldn't look him in the eye and stared at his tacky, Snoopy bath towels neatly placed by the sink. He couldn't believe I'd brought marijuana into his drug free suburban house. John was treating me like a child, and kids hate that. For the first time, I didn't know how to react to him. He didn't seem like such a close friend anymore. If we were at work riding in the van and he tried to throw this authority bullshit at me, I would have told him off and we might have gotten into an argument or even a fist fight. But now he was acting like someone I couldn't talk back to or even be myself around. After that night, I knew we couldn't ever live comfortably at John's house. It would have changed everything. John had 2 worlds: the clean and tidy world in his suburban subdivision with his family, and the down and dingy underground one he shared with the newspaper crew. The next day, Michael and I went to Jonathan's house and told him we were homeless. Jonathan enjoyed our company. We were basically his only friends, so he let us live in the shed in his backyard. He said all we had to do was stay out of sight from his mom, but even if his mom had caught us, she wouldn't have really cared. It would have been something for her to talk to her coworkers at the water cooler. We were originally going to live in the backyard of another friend from our newspaper crew, Benny. Benny was a lot cooler than Jonathan, and he lived in the same neighborhood and had a shed in his backyard too. Benny invited me and Michael to sleep in his shed, but he was mainly doing it to make a nice gesture because his parents were always home. His father was a nocturnal 80-year-old who wandered around their house all night. His mom only worked a few nights a week at a seafood restaurant, so she was always there too. Benny's dad didn't mind me and Michael hanging around, but his mom was a notorious bitch for hating the neighborhood kids, especially me and Michael. Benny and his brothers had a lot of friends, and Jonathan didn't have any besides me, Michael, and Benny. Benny's backyard would not have worked because they were always having people over to their pool. Jonathan was 15 when he stopped going to high school and started working for the paper. Benny was 13. Jonathan was a latchkey kid whose single mom would let him get away with murder. Despite growing up in a poor household, he had feelings of entitlement and expected life to be easy for him. John acted like he was better and smarter than everyone else, also a product of his mother's babying. Jonathan's mom was losing her important son, but she was determined to be his friend first and parent second. They were close, and John would come to her with problems, but that was because there was no risk of discipline. She was the type of mom who'd buy her kids beer on a Friday night. She knew we smoked pot, but she didn't say much about it and actually gave Jonathan money to buy it. She tried as hard as she could to be the cool mom, well informed, but not judgmental. Michael and I were finally on our own, teenagers full of optimism about our future and the wonderful things it held. For a couple weeks, we slept in the shed in Jonathan's backyard, but after our mom heard, she convinced her husband, Guy, to let one of us stay in an empty room in their house. Michael was having a harder time with homelessness than I was, so he went to live with them while I toughed it out. Mom married Guy when Michael and I were in 3rd grade. None of her 4 kids liked him very much, and we all questioned her for settling. Michael was the only one that had a conversation with Guy, and he was an accountant who had a bunch of side hustles like selling Amway, betting on sports, and working at flea markets on Saturdays. Gonna read just a little bit more here. Thank you all for listening. I don't want to be alone, Mom would say. Guy was a huge man, about 6'4" and over 300 pounds. He was mostly fat. He had a Texan accent and spoke with a lisp, but he hardly ever said more than 2 words. Guy took the city bus every weekday to his lame accountant job. The kids in the neighborhood would throw rocks at him and call him Fat Frankenstein. Benny had an ongoing joke where he'd constantly try to be friendly and make conversation with Guy. Guy always ignored him and just quietly growled. A few times, Benny would wait until he knew Michael and I weren't home before knocking on the door for Guy. Mom would answer the door and say, Michael and Gregory aren't home. Benny would smile, wink, and then turn on a Texan accent, just like guys. I'm not here to see them. I'm here to see Guy. Where's that guy? Then he'd see Guy mulling around in the background in his underwear, and Benny would jokingly try to force his way inside. Guy, I see you in there. I want to buy some Amway, Guy. Give me the Amway. Guy may not have said much, but he made plenty of noise with his burping, moaning, flatulence, and heavy breathing. He was like a sad, retired, ailing circus bear that was never too much fun to begin with. My first stint of homelessness wasn't that bad. I went to work every day, spent most of my time with my good friends like Benny, and I always had money in my pocket. For the first time, I didn't have teachers or parents telling me what to do. With no rent or bills to pay, I figured everything I'd heard about life being difficult was just old people talk. It wasn't hard to sneak around Jonathan's house and avoid his mom. Michael and I had practice sneaking around our father's house. For as long as I can remember, we never got fed enough. Michael and I even resorted to eating cat food and dog food at one point. Michael still eats cat food to this day. But we usually just took turns sneaking into the kitchen to grab food. I was at Jonathan's house every day regardless, so if I ever ran into his mom, it wasn't that big of a deal. We were used to our friends' parents not liking us. It'd always been that way. Nobody wanted their kids to hang out with the dirty Brandt brothers who had to steal to eat. It took Jonathan's mom about a month to figure out I was camping in her backyard. Her schedule made her easy to avoid. She was out of the house early every morning and wouldn't get home until late afternoon. By that time, we would have already been picked up by John and off selling newspaper subscriptions in some far off location. At the end of the night, John would drop me and Jonathan off last. There was a gang of other kids to get home, so most nights we wouldn't get back until midnight. Jonathan's mom would be asleep, and even if she wasn't, we'd just go to the woods, the arcade, or down the street to Benny's backyard. Benny's dad didn't mind if we smoked pot. Heck, I remember we used to smoke the bark off of the trees, he'd say. A month later, Jonathan suggested he ask his mom if I could move in their garage. He said his mom liked me and he could convince her to say yes. She charged me rent, but it would be cheap. Before I moved in, his mom sat me down and told me what she expected. I agreed, and the next day we cleaned out their garage and set it up with a bed, air conditioning, cable TV. The best thing about it, the place had a private entrance out their garage and set it's a private entrance where anybody could come and go at all hours. I had the coolest hangout in the hood, and the deal even came with a new family, a fridge full of munchies, and 3 spirited dogs. The one stipulation with me living there was that I had to get a real job and quit working for the newspaper. Benny was working at the original Fuddruckers hamburgers down the street from Jonathan's house, so I decided to work there. It was kind of depressing. I made more money and it was a lot more fun selling papers than it was flipping burgers. I'd pull at least $400 a week for John, but I was lucky to make a couple hundred every 2 weeks at Fuddruckers. Lucky for me, Jonathan's mom only charged me $80 a month to live in her nice garage. Shortly after I moved in, I was arrested for the first time in my life. It was just after I turned 17, so I was convicted as an adult for breaking into a vehicle. Luckily, Texas had recently downgraded my crime from a felony to a misdemeanor, and I didn't have to stay in jail long. However, they gave me a horrible probation stint with a strict, tight-nosed probation officer. He made sure I was under constant supervision and gave me as hard of a time as he could. When I wasn't visiting my PO, I'd be performing an unreasonable amount of community service I was given, where I did backbreaking labor at a park, digging ditches for 8 hours straight in the hot Texas sun. I still hung around the same crowd and everyone still smoked pot. My friends weren't quitting on my behalf. They didn't care if I was on probation, and they did everything they could to keep me smoking. One time I woke up in the middle of the night with Benny blowing a huge bong hit in my face the night before a drug test. My 6 months of probation seemed like a death sentence. When you're a teenager, 6 months is an eternity. I didn't know how I was going to survive without smoking pot. Hanging out with my friends and smoking weed was my identity at the time. Identity is the most important thing to a teenager or a young person. I wanted to continue to do it, but I needed a substitute, so I started using alcohol. There were lots of stores who'd sell alcohol to minors back then. Every morning I'd wake up, walk to the corner, and buy a 40 ounce of malt liquor, which I drank with the hobos in an abandoned parking lot across the street. Certain people shouldn't be on probation. In December of that year, I found out my probation had been revoked and I was to begin serving a 2-month adult jail sentence at the Bexar County Jail in their zero tolerance boot camp facility. Adversity comes in bunches. Right around the time I was found out I was going to jail, Jonathan's mom found the pot garden her son and I had been cultivating in the backyard. The plants were my idea. I was on probation and couldn't smoke pot, so I figured the least I could do was grow some for my friends. Jonathan's mom would have been okay with the plants, but she was also stressing out because of her son's new girlfriend. Jonathan had recently started dating an attractive woman much older than he was. He had just turned 16, but his new, very serious girlfriend was 37. He met her at our local neighborhood crack house. It wasn't what you expect when you hear the term crack house. It was a decent house in a middle class neighborhood that looked completely ordinary if you were ever to drive by. The caretaker was a middle aged junkie named Tona. Tona lived down the street from Benny. One day, one of her friend's kids were playing basketball in her driveway, and Benny was doing tricks on his rollerblades. Benny asked to join the basketball game, and when Tona came out to introduce herself, Benny pulled her aside and said, "Do you smoke marijuana?" Everybody loved Tona. She was in her 30s, but acted like a teenager. Tona had an endless amount of beer and weed for us kids. There were plenty of hard drugs used there, but she did a good job keeping all the heavy stuff in the back room away from anyone too young to handle it. All day, different races and ages would come and go from Tona's house. Some were there to buy drugs, some were there to see Tona, and some just wandered up from the alley in the street. The television was always on, and Tona only watched MTV. This was back when the station played music videos, so it served as an excellent backdrop for all the drug use and interesting characters that frequented her living room. Tona had a huge crack addiction, and I saw firsthand how drugs can destroy someone's vision of reality. She smoked rock, but when she wanted a change of pace, excuse me. Ah, hey Jadakiss, aloha. Almost got 10,000 likes. You guys are watching it live at the recording, but I'm just going to finish up just a couple more pages here. Tona smoked rock, and sometimes she wanted to change of pace, and she'd get really high and she'd inject it in her foot. Sometimes I remember helping her find a tourniquet in an open vein. Her husband, Harry, always kept her supplied. We were lucky to have a friend like Tona, and we'd spend almost every night either at her house or Benny's backyard, drinking beer and smoking weed that she'd given us. Tona hooked us up. She was one of the most generous people I'd ever known, but maybe cocaine does that to some people. She taught us very useful things, however, like how to control your boozing and drink all day. She also taught us how to roll joints with a dollar, open beers with a lighter, and use the stove to light a cigarette. All of this would come in handy later in life. Tona gave us insight into the adult world she knew we'd encounter. In return, we gave her attention. Tona was an agoraphobic drug addict who liked people around her constantly. The only time she left her house was when she had her crackhead husband drop her across town at her crackhead boyfriend's ghetto apartment for a few nights. Her day revolved more on who would come over and what would happen in her living room rather than where she went or what she got accomplished. Tona's husband, Harry, was old, in his 70s or 80s. He was a crackhead too, but he wouldn't start using until he got off of work. He reminded people of John Wayne. Their relationship revolved around their drug use. Harry met Tona when she was working at McDonald's, her first and only job. I never saw them nice or romantic with each other. It was all about the drugs. Tona was 40 years younger than Harry and played the part of his daughter in their sick relationship. Harry's real daughter refused to speak to him, understandably. Harry was the sole breadwinner with a small rose business he owned and operated out of the house. The roses he sold paid for their mortgage and crack. Every morning he'd wake up early, drive to a rose farm, and buy a bunch of flowers wholesale. At night, he'd take attractive women around in his old Cadillac to the sad dive bars and strip clubs in San Antonio. His rose girls would then approach the bar's inebriated patrons and ask them to buy a flower. Harry's rose business supported their lifestyle and enabled them to live in a decent house. There were sexy women in their living room every night. Nothing's better when you're 16 than smoking pot and drinking beer with curvy dames in short skirts and elaborate blouses. Most of the girls working for Harry were only interested in money, so the last thing on their mind was a teenager. But one girl stood out. Janet from another planet was a dark-haired beauty with hair like electric space. She'd been working for Harry off and on for a few years. Most of Harry's girls would spend the majority of the night in the back room doing hard drugs, but Janet stayed in the living room and smoked pot with us kids. She hardly even drank. When the other girls would be behind closed or doing things for money, Janet would be in the living room watching MTV and hitting our homemade bong. Janet fit in with our group. We didn't think of her as 37. She was older than Jonathan's mom, but hanging out with Janet wasn't anything like hanging out with Jonathan's mom. We were a breath of fresh air for her, too. She'd gotten tired of all the aggressive jerks she'd been meeting at bars and strip clubs, slanging roses for Harry. Janet was planning on hooking up with one of us from the start and initially really desired me. But I knew anything between us wouldn't work out. Jonathan, on the other hand, was ready and willing for a relationship and wasn't bothered by the age difference. Janet was an incredible person inside and out, and no one blamed Jonathan for hooking up with her. He was definitely dating out of his league. Jonathan's mom was the only person who had a problem with it, and it didn't necessarily have anything to do with Janet or who she was as a person. The problem was that Janet was older than she was, and she felt like she was being replaced. Janet would smoke weed with us in the woods or in Benny's shed, but John's mom would never do anything like that. His mom might bite a spear, but it was always forced and awkward. The biggest difference was that Janet spoke to us like equals, and that's the best way to earn anybody's respect, is treat them with respect. Okay, so I'm gonna end that right there and take a break because but this is from my book Gonzo Education, and I guess that's the first part of chapter one. So each chapter will be two parts. So chapter one, Gonzo Education, available on Amazon and Barnes and Nobles, and I will read the whole book eventually here. And so go ahead and check it out, everybody. Aloha, thank you.